Hello, everyone. For its June event, the MAAT Climate Collective is delighted to be joined by Georgetown University professor of philosophy, Olúfẹ Táíwò, to discuss his research concerns related to climate reparations. How might we consider and work towards the emergence of reparatory futures in the aftermath of colonialism and transatlantic slavery, even as we struggle simultaneously with the inequalities and disproportionate impacts of contemporary climate breakdown? How might carbon removal, more than a mere technofix of neoliberalism, function as a form of repair for past harms of environmental violence, or as a mode of relationship restoration and the building of new worlds of justice and equity? Olúfẹ Táíwò and his writings have appeared in such publications as The Guardian, The New Republic, Dissent, and his interviews on the Dig podcast. And he's consistently addressed these and related themes. He's discussed how disastrous climate breakdown, plagued by a warming earth, spreading drought and wildfires, melting polar ice and rising seas, and now zoonotic diseases and pandemics resulting from habitat disruption, have been perpetrated by extractive fossil capital. Capital's interests produce massive accumulations of wealth, protected by the antagonistic security of militarized police and the carceral state, forming climate apartheid that Táíwò reads as a police violence crisis, founded upon a vast system of distributive inequality, of food, health, and environmental and housing insecurity. In this sense, abolition, the politics of ending the rule of the police, and more broadly, mass incarceration, combines with the demands of environmental justice as a meaningful politics of system change. Moving toward that end, which Táíwò advocates in his growing writings, we must include energy democracy, localized community control, and public ownership of utilities, all prioritizing public well-being, social justice, and ecological sustainability over the climate apartheid system, securitizing profits of the few over the needs of the many. It will also include climate reparations, where the most powerful, who have benefited over a century and a half of fossil energy development, owe a debt to those now suffering from the worst impacts of climate breakdown, even though they've contributed the least to the causes. Carbon dioxide removal, for instance, might be integral, according to Táíwò, in the emergence of radical system change, inaugurating a new world of self-determination for all. This constructivist view sees reparations as the project of constructing a just world in which the advantages and disadvantages of the transition to the just world are distributed in ways sensitive to past injustices, as Femi Táíwò writes. The Climate Collective looks forward to discussing these and other pressing subjects related to contemporary climate emergency and the emergence of worlds otherwise conceived. So for today's discussion, we'll have a brief presentation by Femi, about 20 minutes long, and then we will come back with a roundtable discussion for about 30 or 40 minutes. So I'll, at this point, hand it over to Femi. Welcome to the Climate Collective. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me and for the introduction. I think I might need to be a co-host to share screens. But while we're getting that set up, I just want to say a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today and my broader view of things. So what I call this view of reparations is the constructive view. It's an old view. People have had it for at least decades. It's not something that I'm coming up with. But I'm maybe using it in a slightly different way than the view of reparations that I'm talking about, or rather I should say the view of systems change that I'm talking about is often used. And that's because this view was developed a long time ago, and thus before climate change was something that people were talking about prominently in the way that they're talking about today. So if anything is novel, it's that. But the basic idea of what reparations is about, or rather, I think the horizon for racial justice is that it's about world making. So it's not within an established political order just a transfer of stuff from one set of hands to another set of hands. That's something that should be part of reparations. That's something that is important about reparations. But I think there's been a view among those who have fought for reparations, among those who have fought for racial justice, and certainly in the intersection of those, that viewed reparations as a more transformative thing. The thing we're doing with reparations is rebuilding the world. And I want to say that literally. And so to say that literally, I have to tell you a little bit about how I think about the world, or rather what I think the world is. So the claim that I'm making is on the right side of the screen, this text box on the right. The claim that's the global social structure that resulted from transatlantic slavery and colonialism. You might call it racial capitalism. In the book that I'm writing, I call it global racial empire. You could just call it capitalism. I don't really care what you call it, but what it is a set of processes. And one of the things that's true about those processes is that they distribute things in a certain way. Social advantages, things like wealth, things like certain kinds of knowledge, things like certain kinds of institutional protections tend to accumulate in certain parts of the world, like the global north, and in certain communities wherever you are in the world, racially dominant communities. That second bullet point should say disadvantages. Disadvantages, things like pollution, things like conflict, tend to accumulate in the global south and in racially disadvantaged communities. And these are things that we notice hold within and across political communities. It's a result that you find in a variety of aspects of social science in a variety of locations. There have been people who have tried to generalize these thoughts, but I think something like this basic idea is true about the world. So if the world is a distributive system, it's this kind of distributive system. It's a racially unjust distributive system. I think that there's a lot of mileage that you can get out of looking at racism in that way, in this kind of systems view way. I am taking my cues here from an important scholar of racial capitalism, who is Ruthie Gilmore. She defined racism once famously as the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. It's a mouthful, but what she's saying is that there are group differences in vulnerability to premature death or material insecurity or, however you'd like to think about the stakes of having advantages and avoiding disadvantages. There's group differences in that vulnerability. Those group differences are themselves something that are produced, and they are themselves something that are exploited. And state does the exploiting sometimes, private individuals do the exploiting sometimes, private corporations do the exploiting sometimes, but those things are produced and exploited. This is a description of systemic behavior, how systems distribute risk, how they distribute vulnerability in ways that are sensitive to hierarchy, including in response to crises. So mapping this back out, walking backwards from that kind of definition to a broader view of the system, racial injustice is about how important things are distributed. That would include security with respect to housing, food, energy, environment, political power, resources, money, and changing how those things are distributed is key to racial justice. I think this is the world making we have to do. I think this is a helpful way of thinking about the world making that we have to do. And here's how it intersects with climate. The effects of climate have converted some groups of people into hyper-exploitable populations. Just for an example, on the left you see a picture of incarcerated firefighters who are working on the fire near Whitewater, California last summer, who are pressed into service for very little pay because they're exempt from minimum wage laws and legally prevented from unionizing. and it compensated instead with just minor reprieves from the harshest versions of prison life, which include the opportunity to see their children. There's hyper-exploitation, but there's also hyper-disposability. On the left, again, you see people who were incarcerated, but this time not being converted as a workforce. This time, there are people who were finally, at the last minute, evacuated from their prison due to high water, which they had been left in for days. This was the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which was a climate-fueled hurricane that devastated Louisiana and much of the Caribbean. And in the aftermath of this hurricane, law enforcement officials were given orders to shoot looters on sight, and white vigilantes murdered black people that they deemed criminal with near total impunity and kind of the tacit go-ahead from the law enforcement powers that be. Those are kind of discrete institutional responses to particular crises, but we could also tell a longer duration story about what's going to happen. There are a lot of facts and figures here that on this particular slide that we could talk about, but I'm just going to draw your attention to the bullet point at the bottom. 1 to 3 billion people, so a sizable chunk of the percentage of people who are alive and who will be alive this century, are projected to be left outside of the climate niche based on the current pace and severity of climate crisis. Each degree of temperature rise roughly corresponds to 1 billion humans left outside the temperature niche. Presumably 1 billion people who will have to move to survive. So those are the stakes that's where global politics is as of now. And the suggestion that I'm making is that the way that we think about reparations should change given this kind of global backdrop. So I'm going to run through what the basic categories are of reparations views as I see them, especially in academic literature, but not just there. And I'm going to say why I opt for what I'm calling the constructive view. One view of reparations is what I call the harm repair view. These are views or arguments for reparations or conceptions of reparations that say, here's what reparations should do. They should repair present harms to individuals which are caused or constituted by past harms. They should take people from a bad level of welfare or well-offedness that they are now to some higher level. They're only at that lower level because of this past harm that we're repairing. So these typically are focused on material harms to things like wealth, for example. They typically operate on a corporate model of responsibility and liability. They're making the kinds of arguments that you often see in legal literature, that injury and tort law in the, especially in the British tradition, but in the so-called Western legal tradition, tends to deal with harm and responsibility. So there's a plaintiff group and a defendant group. And the idea is reparations, typically monetary, sometimes land-based, sometimes a combination. These will make people better off, and that will compensate them for the harm that they incurred in the past. So that's one view of reparations, and it gets something right? People are worse off in some sense today because of these things that happened yesterday. You can, in fact, explain poverty today and incarceration today based on injustices that happened yesterday. So these get something important correct. Another view that also gets something important correct is the relationship repair view. So people who make this kind of argument say that reparations should repair damage to relationships between groups that are caused by past wrongdoing. They prefer a wrongdoing framework to a harm framework. I'm happy to explain why in the Q&A. That's important, but it gets them out of some trouble that the harm repair theorists tend to run into. And they tend to take it that interpersonal relationships, or perhaps the moral relationships of the community as a whole, are the thing that reparations is supposed to fix. So again, let's get something important right. It would be hard to say that the effect of transatlantic slavery and colonialism hasn't, and the atrocities that went into both of those things haven't harmed moral relationships today. But nevertheless, I opt for this third view, this other way of thinking about reparations, that reparations is a political project that tells us how to distribute the costs of creating tomorrow's just world, given yesterday's injustice. So we're building something in the future, not fixing something that we already have from the past that is broken. So we're not fixing a level of welfare, or we're not just fixing a level of welfare, or just fixing a intergroup relationship, but we are also building a new thing. As I've been talking about, it's a view based in distributive justice rather than retributive justice or even restorative justice, and involves a division of labor between forward-looking or future-looking considerations and backward-looking considerations. So we look forward when we want to figure out our target, the thing that we're trying to do, the way that we want the world to be. But we look backward to figure out who should pay and who should benefit from the construction process of getting us from here to that world, to that target. Some might think, where's the reparations in that, right? Reparations is supposed to be backward looking. It's supposed to be an apology or a response to something bad that happened in the past. And these distributive justice arguments you're giving, Femi, are forward looking. So they're not reparations accounts. I think this division is artificial. Social structure itself is an accumulated result of social processes. It is the embodied result of the past. So when we're trying to change that social structure, we are responding to the past. We can just either do that well or poorly. But when we do that, we'll also be responding to the social and political vulnerabilities that this current social structure and the history that created it made. That means that in the case of climate crisis, the social and political vulnerabilities to increased sea level rise, to increased temperature, are also results of the distribution system that history gave us. And so when we're trying to fix that distribution system, we're doing something that falls under the heading of the constructive view. So that's more or less the view of reparations that I'm bringing to the table climate-wise. So in what time remains, I'm just going to run through some stuff that I think is true on the policy level, on the concrete level, as a result of having this particular view about reparations in the abstract, because I think sometimes, it's easy to get stuck in the abstract, but I think we should see what this stuff does in the more concrete world, I suppose. So I'll just run through these quickly, just so that they're on the table and we can talk about them. Mitigation. We are looking for something like a convergence in resource use between the global north and global south, and between differently racialized communities within and across those geographic designations. So consumption and energy use should decrease fast enough in the global north to make space for needed increases in the global south. This is so-called degrowth perspective. Seems to me to be clearly correct. On the adaptation side of things, and these headings are broad divisions in climate policy. I apologize if I didn't make that clear. But there are various ways that the rich nations of the world can materially contribute to so-called sustainable development in the global south, like the Green Climate Fund, or simply stop contributing to resource drain from the global south, which would be debt jubilee, for example. And of course, within nations, things like the Green New Deal could also play this redistributive role that would make fiscal space for material world making. So communities, cities, countries of the global south are likelier to be able to make adaptive changes to their environment when they spend less paying off bankers, corporations, and say the International Monetary Fund. migration is a big deal. I think the whole migration order would need to shift in the direction of resettlement rather than this kind of warehousing camping system that the international system has cooked up in the status quo. What might be involved legally there might be renegotiating international frameworks on what counts as a refugee in preparation for climate change related displacement. The Organization of African Unity had a definition of those displaced by events seriously disrupting public order as refugees, along with stringent non-expulsion clauses. That looks like something to look at. Loss and damage, so unconditional funding for disaster response and managed retreat. If the international organizations we have now aren't up for the job, then we should make new ones. There's a good article by Keston Perry about these sorts of ideas. And carbon removal. The broad thing I think is just that global distribution of responsibility for removal should be much like global distribution of responsibility for mitigation. They should be responsibilities commensurate with cumulative emissions and colonial history. I'm going to say a little bit more about carbon removal just because it seems to be pretty contentious in circles left of center. But it comes down to these thoughts for me. If you ask modelers, people who work on predicting climate temperature and so on and so forth, many of them are of the opinion that carbon removal is something of a requirement to limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius just because of all the emissions we failed to mitigate up until now. And, you know, regardless of whose fault that is, that's the situation that we're in. Carbon removal features in the vast majority of models that are at the scale of the planet, including deep growth scenarios. But despite that fact, it's also true that voluntary carbon removal is part of corporate greenwashing efforts and technofix strategies. If you ask me, the key word is not carbon removal, but voluntary. If we put corporations in charge of the pace and scale and depth of carbon removal, they will find ways to greenwash their agendas that have actually, in my view, little to do with actually solving the Earth system level planetary scale problem that we're facing. The models that we're talking about call for gigatons of carbon removals per year. That's billions of tons. The second largest company in the world is promising a removal rate of 6 megatons, so 0.006 gigatons per year by 2030. That is the second largest company in the world, larger than Saudi Aramco. So I think the serious conversation about carbon removal is a public and community controlled option, one that's actually steered by the needs of people and the planet rather than the needs of shareholders. I don't expect that we will get that from the private world. And there's some cool work by researchers on these very political topics that's worth checking out. That's in the last bullet point there. I've already talked for a while, so I'm just going to direct your attention to the bottom two on these. Checks, always great part of reparations targets, should be part of any reparations package. But also energy democracy, public power, community control over energy, community control over utilities broadly construed. I think those things are central to decommodification and also central to building people power over the things people need to self-determine. And the goal of self-determination is an important one to me. That will pair well with divest-invest strategies, which also aim to empower the vast majority of people, which requires some haircuts for those at the top. There's been 50 trillion USD worth of upward redistribution in the last few decades in the United States alone. Of course, the global number is much larger. If we interrupt some of that upward redistribution, we'll be in a better position to win some of these other fights. Last thing I want to say is more about winning some fights. There's a approach to workers' bargaining that's taking off in the US called bargaining for the common good, which is where organized workers work with community organizations and members to figure out things to organize for using their power as workers that are not just wages and benefits for the people who work, but also for broader community benefit. So the SEIU Local 26 in Minnesota did what Labor Notes called the first climate strike in the US. This model of workers organizing, or workers and community organizing, has been used by Chicago Teachers Union to fight for things like affordable housing, and work to get cops out of schools. So changing the conditions for their students and not just the working conditions for their teachers. And I think with that in hand, that's a good way to get community control, not just over energy and utilities, but over social life more generally. Laws made by citizens' assemblies, community control over budgets. There's something called participatory budgeting, which was developed by the Brazilian Workers' Party, which is something that could be used as a governance model over much of climate policy and much of policy besides. And these fights for democracy, for community control over people's lives, for self-determination, I think will be decisive politically when it's all said and done at the end of the century. But I'll stop there. Looking forward to talking with everybody.
All right, thanks so much, Femi. Lots of issues to discuss there. And Paulo, maybe you'd like to start us off.
Thank you so much, Femi, for this incredible presentation. It's quite remarkable. It was quite remarkable for me how you can sort of move from a sort of philosophical frame until getting to the, to the hard issues of what these policies could, turn into, and some examples of that. And I guess we have, plenty of material to discuss, well over 1 hour and a half. Maybe I just for us to start, and I think it would be great to, since the presentation was also covering a lot, it would be great just to rehearse some of points that you probably already made, but also for our audience to, to be tuned to some questions. And perhaps to start, two very sort of simple base questions to warm up. Of course, when one speaks of reparations, one is looking to, wrongs done in the past. And you being a scholar of colonialism and very much concerned with questions around, the violence of colonialism, how you see, I guess, the histories and legacies of colonialism as a potential cause to the climate crisis. And to complement that very briefly, I'm very much interested to hear from you a little bit. Of course, the questions of reparations is something that's completely entangled in American history and in Black liberation movements. And I'm interested to hear, and of course, you're doing a move here and bringing this to, the case for climate reparations, kind of referring to Ta-Nehisi codes in your work. I wonder how this kind of background, conceptual and activist background, influenced your work in terms of thinking about the kind of contemporary issues around, global warming and the kind of global climate crisis.
Yeah, thanks a lot for both of those. Maybe I'll start with the second one. So, yeah, I think the background of activism, I think, was really kind of a starting point for me, both stuff that I've done and stuff that I've read about other people doing in the past. And I tried, in philosophy, sometimes we're encouraged to kind of start at the abstract level and just say, just win an argument, right? So this person says this about why reparations is good. You pick some fight with them on some arbitrary page of their paper. We can all do that, and that's helpful sometimes. But for me, my initial question was just, what have reparations activists been trying to do? Right? What changes were they trying to make to the U.S. in the case of U.S. organizing, to the Caribbean Community of Nations, in Abuja when the African nations made a proclamation about reparations, in Brazil, right? In so many of the places in the world where there's been talk about this, what were they trying to achieve, and what would have to happen for them to achieve that? And that's what convinced me more than anything else, more than kind of rhetoric. That's what convinced me of the constructive view, right? If we wanted to make the kind of world that these people were trying to make, we would have to change the world in very comprehensive ways. And rather than giving up and saying that's impossible, we should just affirm that. That's what we're trying to do. Let's do it. So that's kind of where I got started. And I think that's also a good pair with your other question about what the history is, what the connection between kind of the violence of history and climate crisis is. So I appreciate this because I didn't actually get to talk about this in the presentation just now. But to me, my understanding of the climate crisis is that it's just the same story, and in a fairly direct way. I mean, I suppose things could always be more direct, but fairly direct way. So if we're talking about emissions, I think there's more or less agreement that the anthropogenic emissions that are driving climate crisis started with the Industrial Revolution and have accelerated from there. And the reason that they start with the Industrial Revolution is because of skyrocketing energy use that made the Industrial Revolution possible, and that translated into not just a change in how Britain was producing goods and services, but how the world was. So on what basis does a change in Britain, in British economic production, result in a change in world economic production? Well, we're talking about situations where we're talking about a situation where Britain is in a Britain and the British economy is in a causal relationship to the rest of the world. That causal relationship is what economists call a market, right? You ask an economic historian, they're going to tell you a story about price and costs and competitions. But if you ask a different kind of historian, they're going to tell you a story on which the world is linked from very new economic linkages that have been established by the establishment of colonial territories, the support of colonial populations on land conquered from indigenous peoples and made habitable by the contribution of coerced labor in the form of chattel slavery. In fact, one of the commodities that was integral to the Industrial Revolution was cotton, which was largely being produced by the enslaved people of the American South, so on and so forth. So regardless of whether you tell the kind of narrow story or the larger story, you're dealing with political and economic linkages that don't just exist because of colonialism and slavery, but in the main are colonial and enslaved and slave trading links. It's the very same routes, it's the very same ships, and it's the very same kind of political economic ecosystem. So the origin story of global racial capitalism and the origin story of the climate crisis is identical.
Maybe somebody else.
Yeah, Femi, I wonder, just in light of this discussion, I'd be really interested, and I'm sure audience at MAAT, how do you view debt in your project? And here I'm thinking it certainly doesn't seem to line up with Denise Ferrar de Silva's notion or debt, but perhaps maybe the debt that is discussed in Moten and Harney's The Undercommons, perhaps. It'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on debt within this context.
So one of the things I talk about in the book is the difference between responsibility and liability. So I think the direct answer to your question depends kind of on how moralized the notion of debt is. So there's a way of talking about there's a way of talking about moral debt that you'll often see in reparations debates and racial justice debates that says essentially there's a group of people or perhaps an institution, a set of corporations or a nation state, right, that stands in the right relationships to the particular people in the past who are doing the slave trafficking or the emitting, perhaps, or the conquering, that they inherit a relationship of responsibility to the people who are affected by the negative fallout of those things. There's another way of talking, though, that is more based in liability. And the distinction, it's one of those distinctions that is not even that sharp in academic language outside of, say, maybe schools of law. But what liability is, when it comes down to it, is just you could say a particular responsibility, a responsibility to pay. So it actually doesn't it doesn't necessarily, I should say, come with the other baggage of, you in some sense, in some extended sense, did this, or you in some extended sense are the right target for emotional blame or resignation or so on and so forth. It just says, like, you have to pay. Maybe you didn't steal the thing, but you got the stolen goods, and so you have to give them back now, right? It's that kind of thing. And I gravitate towards the liability side of things. And there's a number of reasons why, but the main reason why is just if the view that we have is that transatlantic slavery and colonialism built the world, and that's the view that I have, that's difficult to say where debt is not, right? Every one of us is living in a system that would not be here if not for transatlantic slavery and colonialism, right? That's what I'm committed to on the historical side. Everyone's living in a world that has a temperature that it has, and that will go on to have the temperature that it has because of that history and so on and so forth. So I think the best you'll be able to do is something like the liability story. And so I kind of shy away from the language of debt. But it's not a strong... I see there's a there, right? I see what's going on there. I don't have any strong disagreements with people who deploy that language, but it's less of a good fit for the way that I think about things.
I know that TJ has a follow-up, but I just would you then would you be committed to restitution then?
My understanding of restitution is that restitution is tied to harm, and the kind of standard orthodox legal story about harm is that there's some level of welfare you were at before, and we're getting you back to that level of welfare. But that too breaks down if you think. If you think that what transatlantic slavery and colonialism did was build the world, right? So there's no within that world. There's no contrast case.
Yeah, I suppose also the notion of unjust enrichment, perhaps. Yeah. That is part of the.
Yeah, I think you can. I think the unjust enrichment stuff is usually good. You can defeat people's claim that they deserve the stuff that they have, but it's harder to say who else deserves the stuff that they have.
My question is related to what Femi, you were just talking about in terms of a move away from debt as a privileged category. And to look at that and ask you about something more like broad in relationship to climate politics. The UN climate summits have also been moving away from debt for completely different reasons. Maybe because they want to avoid any discussion of climate debt because they're uninterested or not motivated materially, and not surprisingly, to think about the actual conditions of how climate action or climate mitigation and adaptation can simultaneously be a form of building a just world. Rather, that is a context in which climate action has been narrowed to a very technocratic definition, which limits the global climate governance's address of climate breakdown to something that's merely about carbon in the atmosphere, say, and not really about unequal and forms of social violence on the ground, unequal powers on the ground. So I'm wondering if you can say something about where you see the significance of the kind of research and also politics and also activism that you're engaged with. Because from my perspective, it's really crucial to avoid what may be, I don't know what you think about this, but what may be a split or a growing split between, on the one hand, narrowly defined environmental politics that's often about a climate emergency, like we've got to get carbon out of the atmosphere within the next 10 years or we're doomed, but doesn't really have a lot to say about the larger conditions of colonial history, of the history of transatlantic slavery, of all the kinds of intersectionalist, for lack of a better word, or the entangled social and environmental violences of the past. It has very little to say about that. Whereas on the other hand, you have movements that are dedicated to the immediacy, say, of police brutality, of migration stories of horror, of border politics, of the militarization of the police. And those two sides, say, of environmental politics and social justice politics are often completely, on different pages. And that's where I think your proposals and your research and work around bringing them together, whether, for instance, through climate reparations or conceiving of abolition and decolonization as themselves integral to any kind of climate politics. This is so important. I'm wondering what your take is on the kind of the geography of discourse and activism and organizing around these formations, and whether you have a sense of, is this a growing split, or are things coming together in crucial ways? Maybe both.
Yeah, maybe both. It's interesting to me that you have that perspective. I've been wondering about this myself. I feel like in my circles, they're coming together. I'm seeing more people on the environmental side of things talk about racial justice, and I'm seeing more people on the racial justice side of things talking about environmental justice. I'm seeing more feminists talk about both, et cetera, right? And I wonder, I've been wondering, is that just the bubble that I'm in? Is that an effect of who I talk to, or is that what's going on more generally? And I don't know the answer. But as you said, I have a side on that. I think these things should come together, and I think conceptually speaking, they are together. The difference between environmental justice struggles, thinking about the carbon in the atmosphere by 2030 or 2035 or whatever, and a racial justice struggle thinking about policing, in fact, those are struggles that are only different in terms of years, right? As crisis builds, that prompts institutional responses, and those institutional responses set the terms for who will be exploited and to what degree they'll be exploited, right? So really, it's just, we could try to organize our politics around parts per million, and have a conversation about policing through that's always going to be years behind as institutions change and respond to crisis. We could have a conversation about policing that's just thinking about the present, which maybe we ought to do, but we're going to be in this situation. We're going to be in some situation 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. But I think, there's room to do both, and we'll need to do both. And it's hard to win a final victory against either of these things without winning something on the other things. The danger of the temperature isn't about just how the Earth system responds. It might even be primarily about how our institutions respond. And if we think about it in those terms, the connections to policing and reproductive justice and labor justice get a lot more obvious, I think.
Yeah, I think the problem is when vested interests, corporate interests, and institutional power become invested in narrating a proposed solution to climate breakdown, very much in the way in which they're defining climate and environmental breakdown, which is itself very limited. And when they're defining their proposed solutions, say, for instance, within geoengineering as a technofix, not so much carbon dioxide removal, but actually solar radiation management, like that side of the heavily Silicon Valley supported research and engineering practices. This is really one skeptical way of looking at this is basically kind of ideological machinery to guarantee the continuation of the status quo in terms of the inequitable division of resources long into the future, and merely trying to provide a solution to again, atmospheric carbon. So it's I think this is basically the larger global struggle that we're in against, say, green capitalism, ultimately. So my what I'm thinking about a lot these days is how can we shift this narrative? How can we tell different stories that insist on this convergence of socio-environmental conditions and bringing about the terms of the kind of just world building project that you're talking about. I think this is really so crucial as a counter model to what the dominant institutions and interests around green capitalism are arguing for.
Yeah, I think the insistence on I think the view of reparations as a constructive process, and the constructive view in general, I think part of the point is, one, that we should have a view of the way that we should want the world to be. And second, that's the way that we should evaluate some of these competing political ideas, right? So I think the way that the Technofix discourse works is exactly how you put it, right? It narrows what's up for discussion, right? So this current trajectory of emissions and the current power structure around who controls what gets produced and how much of it gets produced, all that's off the table. The only thing we're going to discuss is, if there's any climate problems, do we have something that we control that doesn't affect our portfolio to answer it with, right? And I think that goes for geoengineering in terms of solar radiation management. I think that goes for carbon removal. I think that goes for renewable energy, right? I think that goes for solar, for wind. I think that goes for water. I think one of the things we have to decide is not just what we are against, what we want to prevent, displacement and mass death, etc., but we have to decide what we're for, institutionally speaking, so on and so forth. And the disagreements we're being invited to by the corporate powers that be are over whether or not to give them credit, essentially, for being a little better tomorrow than they were yesterday. But that takes off the table, maybe you shouldn't exist, right? If we're talking about Shell, for example, or Exxon, I'm taking their existing off the table. That's not part of the world that I want, right? And whether or not you promise to pet 100 kittens or sequester a few tons of carbon, that's not part of the world that I want. And I think we have to get it down to those terms.
If I can jump in here, I'm really struck by this idea of kind of using these terms of bringing together these two worlds that we find all very logical, even if perhaps that's still an argument. Using these terms to kind of evaluate any proposition, any fix that is put forward. But I think that what you're saying around sort of we have to decide kind of the world we're for, or the kind of world making that we're interested in, does then pose a question for kind of when we're faced with these fixes. And I mean, your climate redistribution suggestions or proposals, in many ways, I think, build on the tradition of these kind of abolitionist or reparative activist traditions of offering up kind of quite practical, bite-sized chunks almost of really massive imaginaries, right? I mean, who defines what a bite-sized chunk is? I suppose, defunding the police is an example of things that, again, look very logical, seem really easy, but for many seem impossible. But the kind of options you've offered up are these kinds of very practical inputs. But when we're trying to operate from the point of evaluating inputs on the basis of new world making, I think we do come up against kind of stuck moments, or certainly I do. Lithium comes to mind, certainly sort of carbon removal is very much one of those things. And of course there's carbon removal and then there's carbon removal, right? There are many ways of doing that. I'm interested to kind of hear from you, like, how do you then apply these terms of new world making when we are faced with, as you say, carbon removal seems to be a necessity, right? We have to do this. How do you apply these kinds of frameworks to what can otherwise be fixes very much of a different sort of epistemic agenda? How do we use these tools to reimagine fixes that are being offered to us that we know are not good enough?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I can only really say how I try to. But the kind of philosophy that I do, the way that I think about things, is in the tradition that folks call materialism, right? So the basic thing, we're human beings, right? We're material creatures. We need stuff. If we don't get it, we'll die, right? And history kind of starts there, and that's how you explain stuff. Another use of that kind of fundamental thought, I think, is, we can use that in an evaluative mode. So, like, what are the hard constraints, the kind of absolute constraints on what we can do, and what we need to do to make a better world? There's a direct way of using that thought in climate crisis, right? There's, all this science that we do around what the Earth system is like, right? So I don't think these arbitrary, well, I shouldn't say that. There are temperature targets, 1.5, 2, right? It's not that if we hit 2.1, the whole world is over. And it's not that if we hit 1.9 or 1.4, whichever your favorite target is, that everything is fine, right? They're just kind of benchmarks that help us evaluate how things are going. But nevertheless, we have a bunch of science that we use to try to answer the question, what will happen to global average temperature if a bunch of other stuff happens, right? And insofar as we have political goals that involve reaching a particular temperature or avoiding a particular temperature, then those are the hard constraints on what we can do or should do. So the hard constraint question about carbon removal or about emissions mitigation isn't, what political use are the people I'm talking to making of this technology? The question is, what do the models look like with this technology, and what do the models look like without it, right? That's a hard constraint. That's a constraint the material world is putting on us. Then the question from there is, okay, if this thing needs to happen in some way, some shape, or some form, what's the shape and form that is coherent with our politics? Right? It's this kind of two-stage thing. Is the way that carbon removal is being talked about in these political conversations coherent with that politics? No, then I should find a different way of talking about it that is, or a different way of rolling it out that is. And we could do that with solar, which we should. We could do that with wind and water. Those kinds of questions will, direct us to what the kind of political soft problems are and what the kind of geological hard problems are, if I can, be a little crude about it. So I think that's I think that's pretty much how I try to think through it, right? Sometimes your back is up against a wall. But like, what kind of wall is it? I think that's really the central question, right? The last thing I should say is, just because a problem isn't geological doesn't mean it's not a real problem, or doesn't mean it's not a serious problem, right? It is a problem that discourse about something is going in a bad direction. The point of the distinction is, we solve political problems in different ways than we solve geological problems. And so the things that we have to do to address, or the things that we can do to address the way the Earth system works, are different from the things that we can do to address how our political system works. Sorry, I feel like that was a rambling answer, but hopefully I said something coherent.
Maybe I want to pick up on that question of the geological. I think that's maybe a good jump in, and also connect to TJ's point, of this split between, let's say, the corporate technocratic discourse that says, we can, in fact, fix the earth with this deployment of these new technologies, which we know are militarized technology and things like that. And at the same time, other social movements somehow this question is not sort of central to their agenda. And there is a sort of split on that, but there's also a question of scale here. And I want to try to get to this question of scale because I think it's important to your word making view of the word and what, reparations could be. As TJ mentions, this is a crucial point, the sort of intersection between those, the sort of anti-racism, anti-capitalism, anti-colonial struggles and how they incorporate the environmental agenda. And it's important to tell those stories. And I just want to say that as a way of introducing, because I think somehow those histories have always been there. Ancient abolitionists, anti-colonial struggles, they had a sort of environmental dimension because it was very much also about, expropriation of land and how labor was entangled to the land. And somehow we need to recuperate those histories and say, these types of struggles, they were already environmental, and what kind of lessons one can, learn from it. And we can understand the conflict that we are in. I think your work, Femi, is very much doing this job of reshaping that stories. But that's that's just one part of what I want to say. I want to address this question of scale because you seem to speak about there is the kind of legacy of this word making of colonialism and racism is this sort of uneven distribution of advantage and vulnerabilities, this uneven distribution of risk. And what we see now in, with the COVID crisis, with the climate crisis, is that somehow, the sort of uneven distribution of risks, it's going to get more uneven than it is, right? So the kind of wealthy, they're going to bunker themselves against climate change. They're going to have, defense systems and insurance and things like that, where the mass of the poor is going to be in a completely state of vulnerability and be treated as, as refugees are today, right? As a questions of, humanitarian aid and not of self-determination. But still you see this as a sort of opportunity, to sort of transition to a more just world. And I want to address this question that you mentioned, instead of a restorative sort of repair, you're talking about a distributive one. You also talk about a kind of constructive dimensions of reparation. There's always this sort of looking towards somehow the future in something that can be built and how we can somehow address, the legacies of this present now in 20 years on, when we have like masses of refugees and, eventually unemployment and so on. But this seems to require, because you conceive the word as a sort of distributive system, as almost something I think you mentioned in your podcast, reparations operating almost on a global, eventually on even a geological scale. And here we see a sort of split, because the global systems of governance and power, they are the ones who are sort of, moving towards this technofix and this sort of, a language of technocracy, as if we can, just making green new deals and this is going to solve our problems. Whereas, the other sort of questions that TJ was mentioning yourself, like, the sort of legacies of global racial capitalism, they are being addressed by communities, right? That's most of the time are disenfranchised and do not have the power to enforce this distributive reparative system on a global scale. a long question just to ask you, how do you navigate between, you know, those scales in your thinking about the world and also in terms of your activism and what you're seeing on the ground? And I think this question of the local and the global is always something that brings us to tension in terms of a system of global governance that would potentially be required to fix the planet on a global scale, you know, to redistribute massive wealth, to redistribute massive resources, as you were mentioning.
Yeah, it's a really deep question.
Sorry for that.
No,
Not for you.
I'm a philosophy nerd. Those are my favorite. I think. So let me answer the last part of it first, because I think it will help with the larger thing. But just how do I navigate it? Well, I try to think of tactical stories that involve a distributed effect of small-scale political actions. Right, so I do talk about, I mention like a green climate fund, which is at the nation state level. I mention, you know, thinking of an alternative to the International Monetary Fund. But really my theory of change is movements for public power, movements for community control over energy, movements in the bargaining for the common good, community level workers, and community organizing, right? That's really the story that I have. And the reason why that's at least an attempt to navigate the problem that you're talking about is because I'm actually not of the opinion that our best chance is something like a massive centralized planetary scaled system of government. For a variety of reasons, which I think are well rooted in kind of, you know, systems analysis, systems theory. I actually think it might be better. It might not even be a second best option. It might be better to have a lot of communities trying a lot of different things from the point of view of system stability. That's another way to get system stability. You know, I mean, that's not my motivation for it, but it's just another point in favor of this kind of distributed community level approach. But I really think there are deep, very difficult to resolve social cleavages between different parts of the world, between different communities that are even neighboring to each other, right? And I just like our chances better if we don't have to resolve all of them or organize across all of them at a planetary scale, right? I don't see how well that would go. So I think there's a limited role for the national level system. It's going to be Green New Deal type things. There's a limited role for the international or supranational role. They can, in very crude ways, move capital from this continent to this other continent and kind of organize that. But in terms of a overarching plan that somebody at the UN is coordinating, that's not the story, for exactly the reasons you're bringing up, right? I don't think it would work. So I think it's just a lot of social movements working in awareness of each other, when possible in concert with each other, but when not possible on their own. And that's probably the best we can do.
Following up on that, the position of someone like Andreas Malm and Jody Dean and others come to mind who have been writing recently about the need for a kind of climate Leninism, or what Andreas Malm calls war communism, that this is what we need. We need a massive takeover at the global nation state level of these massive systems in order to reorient the path to the future. And this may sound good in a lot of ways. And I'm thinking of Andreas Malm's recent book on Corona and climate change and chronic emergency is one place where you see that argument. But then if you follow the criticism or the discussions of these books, and I'm thinking of one context in Red May that had a panel with Andreas Malm, and it's pointed out that there's something that's strikingly absent in that argument, which is the lack of any kind of organized working class to bring about the climate Leninist revolution that will be necessary to take over those large-scale infrastructural and institutional apparatuses. And that, in other words, is to point out the fact that we're living at a time of a historical low point of organized labor. So we can easily, more or less, formulate proposals for a global Green New Deal. But what does it mean when we can't even barely begin to organize locally to try to change our small-scale city council that's thoroughly dedicated to a kind of green capitalist position? And at least in my circles of organizing in California, I'm finding that I think that in some ways the best way to get into a larger scale global conversation about what needs to be done in terms of policy is precisely through local organizing, through building relationships and forms of solidarity on the ground where you are, so that you can begin to develop the organized networks that could then potentially someday be scaled up, but they're nowhere near that possibility, in my view, right now. So it also, that local organizing allows anyone to get involved in this and start to understand and have much better perception of what the dynamics of the struggle are, what it means to be in solidarity with others, what it means to build cooperative networks of mutual aid, and to try to enact policy transformations on a small scale. I'm not saying we have to choose one or the other. Maybe we have to think across these different scales at the same time. That's absolutely necessary. But the local has to fit into this somewhere, and that's really crucial. So I suppose to throw it back at Femi, you ended your presentation with a discussion of organizing, basically. And you pointed to some examples like the Service Employees Union and Chicago Teachers Union. How do you deal with, in terms of your theory of change, like the fact that we have these massive challenges when it comes to the organization of multiracial working class struggle, which is so necessary to any transformation? If anything, it looks like we're moving in the opposite direction. I'm thinking of the failed Bessemer Amazon union effort, for instance. I know that's a really problematic case because there were a lot of bad decisions made that went into that. But nevertheless, we're dealing with real challenges in terms of the gig economy, precarious workers, and the continued dispossession of the working class of any kind of political agency.
Can I just add one British example, which is interesting to what you're saying to that comment, TJ? Like when Theresa May was ran the Home Office, like her hostile environments policy was actually pitting the illegal migrant who is working at substandard wages from the unionized worker, and it was to protect union labor. We have to then transform Britain into a hostile environment so that illegal migrants and illegal labor. So you had this really strange invocation of traditional forms of unionized labor in the UK that are perceived to be under threat through the influx of undocumented migrants, etc. So there was this kind of really bizarre invocation of of the history of unionized labor as somehow that which needs to be protected from, and the hostile environment policy is then going to attend to that. But of course, we know that that unionized labor has been decimated by, for many decades, precisely through Tory politics. But anyway, I just wanted to add that as a strange kind of like example that's operating here.
Yeah. I'm curious what other folks in the group think about this. I will, of course, go first because I was asked. But yeah, I mean, to me, I guess I have a few things to say. Just following up on what Susan was saying. There's kind of tensions no matter what scale you start at, right? So the workers' movements have not always been bastions of progressivism, and the legacy of workers' movements have not always been used in that way. So it's not always the workers' fault for this misuse, right? But I mean, here in the States, beyond the kind of much belabored relationship between the white working class and the oppression of black folk, there are also kind of organized campaigns to make some unions white only in the US and South Africa. There was support by, I believe, the Knights of Labor for the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's not all, being right about one thing doesn't make you right about everything, right? That's life. So that's just to admit that my point about starting at small scale politics isn't some recipe for guaranteed victory, for justice. But why do I back that instead of maybe this other climate Leninist approach? I just, I mean, I think TJ pointed out rightly that we're missing a strong, militant, and organized global workers' movement. I would add that we're also missing a Lenin. And we're also missing a favorable geopolitical situation. There was strong imperial deadly competition in the decades leading up to the Russian Revolution of 1917. Today, in 2021, we are slowly but surely moving away from geopolitical unipolarity under the hegemony of the United States, but we're also, far from a period like the Cold War was, where there was, nation-state level opposition, not just ideological opposition, but opposition that came with military budgets and fomented revolutions to the ongoing global consensus of capitalism, right? Angola and Mozambique and Cape Verde were all militarily assisted by Cuba and China and Bulgaria and the Soviet Union, because they were governments willing to do that sort of thing. If the workers of Bessemer were to rise up, which nation state would be the one funneling arms to them? I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that question. I suspect it's nobody, but I think there is a plausible story in which substantial amounts, there's a plausible story on which non-state actors seize state power and use it for their ends. That plausible story in this century seems to be more on the model of ISIS than on Lenin. We could look at Mozambique right now. We could look at Nigeria and the Sahel for that matter. But that's the alternative model to the state system that is winning territory, as far as I can tell. So I'm not ideologically against the idea of climate Leninism. I just can't tell myself a coherent story of how we get there from here.
Just kind of to pop in a slightly different position, at least as far as like organized labor is concerned. In principle, I live in a country with incredibly organized labor. And in fact, unions are not, I wouldn't even consider unions localized here in the sense of just scale. And up until recently, power. And in principle, the country is run by a tripart alliance of the African National Congress, the unions, and the Communist Party. In principle, definitely not in practice. And I mean, that's kind of interesting. It's like interesting for me to think about this kind of idea of organized labor as a potential response to thinking around localized responses from the context of South Africa. And I suppose the thing that it brings to mind is the question of like what constitutes a radical politic, in the sense that something like this conversation certainly doesn't feature in kind of organized labor in South Africa at the current moment. I mean, we have one of, if not the largest single emitter of CO2 in the world, the electricity generator here, but we also have almost no electricity, right? And we have regular breaks in electricity. So the idea of slowing the production of that generator is kind of nationally impossible, no? And the unions would certainly never support that. And so how to kind of shift an imaginary that starts to think through some of their more sort of leftist radical positionalities in relation to climate and how these connect. I think the question is, how do you enable that imaginary? And I suppose, TJ, that was partly your question for things like COP, right?
Yeah, I think the, in some ways, Green New Deal is trying to bring together historically worker-oriented interests and environmental interests to refuse the, I think what hopefully we would all agree with is a false binary between the interests of labor and those of the environment. That's been used as a wedge to basically divide and conquer, to keep the argument going, to say that it's either jobs or the environment. You can't have both. The Green New Deal says, yeah, you can. It's possible to have a workers' Green New Deal. It depends on how it's defined. And the big, I think, organizing imperative is to prevent the Green New Deal from turning into a Green New Colonialism or something like that, basically a continuation of the rescue of racial and colonial capitalism, instead of the kind of constructive world building project that Femi is talking about. But I wanted to lead to maybe my last question, which is, if we think of coronavirus and what's happened during the last year and a half, as exemplary of the condition of what's happening with nation states, with power, with wealth, with elite institutional interests, within the conditions of the unfolding climate emergency that we're faced with today. If anything, it's shown possibly a really dystopian path to the future. We've seen, like Femi mentioned, the 50 trillion transfer of wealth upwards from 1975 to 2018. I would be curious to know what that figure is from 2020 to 21. We know that billionaires have increased their wealth by many degrees. It's just incredible what's happened. Meanwhile, we've had this breakdown of state welfare responsibility. At the same time, resources have been thrown into the security state. So we're seeing transformations now that are very much not moving toward any kind of equitable, socially just futurity. Rather, it seems like it's quite the opposite. Like within the States, for instance, we've just gone through a pandemic in which some 700,000 people have died, yet we come out of it and we still don't have universal health care. This is incredible. I mean, can we not read this as symptomatic of what climate change is doing to our politics and where we're headed for the future? So my question, which is very speculative to Femi, is, what do you see? I know it's different what we want to argue for, what we want to struggle for, but what do you actually see in the cards for the future?
Oh boy, it's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will time. Yeah, I think my impression of things, there's this economist, Gernot Wagner, I think, who described COVID-19 as the climate crisis at warp speed. He's a climate economist. But it's the same kind of stages of institutional, first denial, then downplaying, then kind of panicked rollout of the wrong set of practical responses, and then suffering. It's more or less the kind of progression of things that happened in COVID, and that's more or less, I think, what's happening, what has happened, and unless we are successful, what will continue to happen with climate crisis, right? Exxon knew about this for decades, and got to work with their friends in the American Enterprise Institute, seeding misinformation on climate for decades as well, and astroturfing all kinds of bad science and bad politics around climate crisis and engineering this current moment. They've been hard at work. And here we are in 2021, well after at least the worst bits of the misinformation have been effectively beaten back in most of the world, right? Even to some degree the US, which was by far the worst in this respect. And, now you see all these net zero pledges, and now you see quote unquote voluntary carbon removal, and now you see ads about green this and green that. And it all seems just to invert it, like COVID-19 in slow motion, right? Where, the things that we actually have to do from a mathematical perspective, cut consumption, cut energy use, publicize, socialize huge sectors of the economy, functionally destroy oil and gas industries, the things that we actually have to do to address the crisis for real aren't even on the table politically in reasonable rooms of discussion. Just as all the things that we had to do when the pandemic was going around aren't on the table, and still aren't. Like universal health care still isn't in the US. So yeah, rant over. Pessimism of the intellect. But
But don't you think, Femi, that like with COVID, it's really re-entrenched the notion of the state, and that's what I find really kind of like, it's been as opposed to sort of the multinational corporation doesn't have the same role to play, and the state is now the Westphalian state, with a border, a hard border, in fact, like there's a certain kind of return to a conception of state that emerged alongside the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm not sure quite how to read that. Is that an advance from neoliberalism to something worse? Or is that... Yeah. Or, yeah, is that an advance from neoliberalism to something worse? Or is that maybe... Is that exploitable by the Green New Deal type political agendas? I'm hoping the latter. I'm not sure I would guess the latter in a purely predictive mode of thought. But I think it's the thing we should try for.
No, just to close, I know we are already totally over time. I'm sorry for Femi also. We are, draining you. But there is this text by this Chinese collective. I forgot the name. I'm going to pick up this for us. When they say, they sort of make an alignment of the history of capitalism with the history of the pandemics. There are several structural pandemics in capitalism. And those moments of crisis are also ways when capitalism shifts itself, transforms itself from the inside, sort of advancing new forms of exploitation, new forms of, bodily discipline, new forms of regulations of, people's movements and things like that. In architecture, I am an architect. That's very clear. We studied a lot of questions of disease in the urban environment because they really allow urban planners along history to sort of align new ways of designing the city with new demands of capitalism and new demands of power. In what seems to me that is happening with COVID was really a way for a kind of neoliberalism 4.0, I don't know, to advance itself in a scale that was unimaginable somehow before, in terms of accumulation of wealth, in terms of expansions of systems of control of population, which has been incredible because there was huge investments in digital technologies. So the digital economy sort of scaled up, and with that also forms of, social control. And it seems to me that this is the kind of response that we are getting from this crisis, in parallel with the militarization of the police, or with a sort of a fortification of sort of state forces in many different ways. And whereas the response to that, and this is something that we discussed already, could be very much through the lens of repair, right? Because what was the question of, people they cannot, make social distancing because they don't have good housing. They don't have good infrastructure. They don't have good insurance. They don't have, a healthcare system that would allow us to create this sort of, resilience global system that would save the sort of body of the earth, because everyone has the sort of environmental means of having a decent life, rather than, enforcing just digital control so people cannot move. So you see what I mean? If the response was through repairs and say, the COVID is also a symptom of, something that we have been seeing happening all along, how we can address that. But instead, I think we have to be positive. I agree, but the kind of scenario, and I maybe because I'm also speaking from Brazil, it's really like precarization of jobs, the kind of dismantling of welfare in many different ways, but I guess the sort of, just to bring it back, if reparations were at the table, I think the responses would be different, if we thought through this sort of framework, which I think is what Femi, bring to us in a very powerful way.
Something else that if I can just add on to that briefly, something else that I think his work brings to us to think about, which is something I really think is crucial, is connecting, the politics of self-determination, which might be achieved through reparations, to actual distributive justice in terms of distributing the resources and the wealth so that people can be put in the position of actually realizing forms of self-determination and not just imagine it. And I think this transfers in many ways to the cultural context and artistic practices, where that world is incredibly wealthy in terms of imagination, but very impoverished when it comes to the equitable justice of realization. And I'm wondering if this is something that I'm thinking about within, looking at artistic practices. Like, how can we think of attempting to reorganize within those contexts of progressive and social justice, racial justice, economic justice work, so that it's not just about imagining different worlds, but actually committing resources and building power within forms of solidarity work and organizing, so that we can put ourselves in the position of actually carrying it out. This seems to be really a crisis today, when we're faced with such a disconnect within the art world between its radical imagination and the impoverished means of actually realizing those kinds of world-building projects. So I think, Femi, that some of your writings speak directly to this urgency, which I hope we will continue to think about. I think we have to.
Yeah, thanks for saying, and I hope they do. But because I myself, I'm not sure. I'm blown away by how creative this stage of capitalism is, and just how clever, the whole idea of cheering essential workers and then sending them into the field anyway. It's just it's hard to beat. It's hard to beat a system that's that adaptable to, there's that resilient, even at the ideological stage, right? To valorize what to me seemed like a naked upward redistribution of security, right? Rather than, make people's profits vulnerable by finding ways to support people to stay home and observe the lockdown protocols. They found ways not only to force people out of the safety of their homes and into the workplace, but to claim a victory in doing so. That to me seems like a very difficult social system to dismantle. And I'm not sure how we're going to do that. But I'm hopeful nonetheless, The one upshot of doing a kind of research where I study, some of the worst things human beings have built and done, is that I just know for a fact that people have survived very difficult things, and that means that we can. And people have found ways out of, frankly, worse situations. The Haitians destroyed slavery on it. Right? People have, with less, done more than what we're trying to do. And so that's my sliver of hope. I believe that we can.
All right. Anyone have a last question, or should we wrap it up there?
I feel like that's a good place to end.
Okay. Yeah.
I agree with Haiti.
Yeah. We can end with the promise, the historically unfulfilled but yet hopeful promise of Haiti. For a new world building project around social and environmental justice. So I'd like to thank everyone, Paulo, Mo, and Susan. Thanks so much for being here. And Femi, It's been great to discuss with you all of these crucial issues. Thanks so much for your contributions and generosity. It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to have you join us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me.